morning, everybody. It's February something, 2020. I'm here at 55th and 7th Avenue. Here on Bike Talk. A couple of things I wanted to discuss this morning. Let's see. Number one, I watched the mayor's State of the City report. He gave it at the Museum of Natural History underneath the Blue Whale, surrounded by a lot of people, city council and a lot of other people. And I watched the whole thing. I just wanted to see what he really had to say. A couple of things stood out. One was that there were things that he didn't say that really stood out. And one was about the fact that 2019 was just the worst year for cyclists. Just the bloodiest, most deadly year. And he didn't even mention that. He just mentioned Vision Zero and said two things that really stood out. One, you're going to dedicate another 100 people or police to enforce Vision Zero. They're going to be the Vision Zero squad, right? Or whatever. I don't understand why police, a 35,000 police force, isn't already enforcing these traffic laws if that's what their job is. I don't understand why we need another 100 people. And I think there's been a lot of criticism that when you do that, you have a lot of unconscious bias. The enforcement tends to be racially skewed, right? And so just adding more police style enforcement isn't really the best value. It's not the best thing that we can do. It's going to have the greatest value for the greatest number of people. Right, red light cameras, infrastructure, all kinds of things are the kinds of things. So that's one thing that stood out. But the other was that he said that he had a whole section on climate change, and we're going to fight climate change. But he didn't mention cars once about it, or transportation. I mean, he did, but so briefly. He basically said, so this is the other thing, he said, we're going to transform the entire fleet of city vehicles to electric vehicles. So that's, I guess, like Parks Department vehicles and garbage trucks or something like that. He didn't mention if the police SUVs will all be converted as well. So I'm not sure. Right, he wasn't really specific on how many vehicles we're even talking about. But I think the main thing my main issue with it is he didn't really mention what the impact of this would even be. So, right, if you're talking about climate change, you're talking about carbon emissions. And if you're talking about carbon emissions, just give me a number. You say there's this much carbon emitted by these sectors. For example, 30% of our carbon comes from transportation in New York City. I think that's basically accurate. So you might say, okay, well, how much carbon is it? And what are the steps to curbing that? And so if we converted these city vehicles to electric, great. Like, how many vehicles is it? 10,000, 5,000, 100? I don't know. And how much carbon were they emitting before? And now factoring in carbon emitted from our sources of electricity to power these vehicles and how many miles they travel typically, you can model all of this. How impactful is this change, in reality? I think that's what's absolutely missing from the whole discussion. Because I think, my gut tells me these vehicles are like a drop in the bucket in terms of how many vehicles there are in New York City operating, right? They don't represent many in terms of any measure, right? Just number of vehicles is probably 0.01% or something that are in the city at any given time. Oh, what's going on here? Is this guy important? I don't know. Oh, they're looking, it's a company and they're looking at this. Bowery Mission. Oh, it's great. Oh, that's really great. They're on the NASDAQ. Or something. They're on this thing. I guess these guys are the names. Way to go, James. Woo! So when you talk about this stuff, oh boy, it's gonna be tricky. Tricky dicky. Tricky dicky. Yeah. Careful. Trust me, I totally understand the risks of what I'm doing, and I am fighting to make them better with Bike Talk, where I talk about all the problems while I bike on terrible infrastructure or non-existent. And yeah, so I think when you go back to, hey, that's really great, we're going to convert, 500 vehicles to electric. Great. What does that do? Is that just scratching at the edge? Oh my God, this Ram, this 4x4, look at how high the front of it is. The hood of it is so high. This will kill you if you get hit. Same with this, is Acura. Like, you just get killed if you get hit by one of these guys. Look how high that is. It's probably like 4.5 feet tall, the hood of that that vehicle. So I didn't mention Vision Zero. So, I mean, he mentioned Vision Zero, but he didn't give numbers to anything. And that, I think, coming from a company where numbers are everything, and coming from, like, also hearing Bloomberg talk about, being data-driven and seeing kind of the impact that he's had, he talks a lot about being data-driven, right? And using numbers to instruct your positions on things and what you're going to do. Oh, this guy's moving around here. And so if you're going to do some numbers on this, you might say, okay, well, 220 people were killed last year in traffic violence. Okay, well, here's how we're going to talk about that. He's like, we're going to give 1,000 school zones a stop sign. You're like, really? That's the thing you're going to do? And what impact do you think that's going to have? Like, project it. And I think that's the difference between key results and just like activity. You say, or objectives and impact versus activity. Activity is just like doing a bunch of things, but not really connecting the dots on whether or not it will have any results. But you want to print results. So for example, that restricting vehicles will obviously have a great impact on schools and things like that. Like if you remove parking or remove some of the, remove some of the space that's dedicated to cars. Yeah. Right, like for example, the DOT has data that says that when you put a protected bike lane in an area, all like pedestrian injuries, cyclist injuries, and motorist injuries and deaths all go down by whatever, between 10 and 50%, depending on your measure and various things. And so you would look at that and be like, okay, this is clearly the most impactful kinds of things we can do right now. Unless something else has a greater impact, do that, print that all day long. But that's not what he's doing. He's just putting in stop signs and converting converting vehicles to electric. Now I realize one is towards the goal of emissions, but even that doesn't have any numbers associated with it, so we have no idea. My guess is that that's about as impactful as when de Blasio says, I don't want to, it's not efficient for me to, when he takes his SUV, his Chevy Suburban, which burns like 8 gallons per mile or something. That's what I want on my bike. Whoop, whoop. Like here. Beep, beep, beep. Move to the side, please. So like, it's funny because de Blasio will say, oh, it's totally worth it for me to take my Chevy Suburban, you know, 12 miles from whatever, Gracie Mansion to Brooklyn, to go work out for an hour because I need to be efficient. You know, I need to get to meetings, I need to do all this stuff, and it doesn't make sense for me to like ride the subway, which is a crazy, I mean, like we can just take that whole argument apart, but what he's basically implying is his individual contribution to global warming from doing that is like negligible, right? I mean, he's basically saying his carbon emissions from that trip are just, you know, are negligible. And I think like that's funny because when you look at his big thing of converting vehicles to electric, he hasn't given any numbers, and my guess is that it's also negligible. That's my guess, is that it's roughly the same impact as if he was taking the subway every time, right? Than his Chevy Suburban. Hey-o, hey-o. Right, I mean, it's obviously not the same, but it's close. Because it's like, okay, it's 0.0001% or 0.001%. And it's like, okay, you're scratching at the edges here, man. You're not taking any real bold action in a way that the city needs to when you talk about this stuff publicly. Like, the actions don't match the rhetoric in any conceivable sense. Like, yeah, we're gonna convert a couple hundred vehicles or whatever it is. Oh, look at this guy. Oh boy. Anyway, thanks for watching. This has been Bike Talk.NYC, and over and out. Like and subscribe.